What does God really say about slavery? This question has challenged people for centuries. It's a topic rooted in ancient history, reflected in sacred texts, and tied to deep moral and spiritual questions that still resonate today. But what if I told you that the Bible's message, while complex, points to justice, liberation, and the dignity of every human being? Let's take a closer look at what the Bible actually says about slavery, how we can understand it, and what it means for us today. To start, we need to understand the historical context of the Bible. Slavery in the ancient world was vastly different from the race-based chattel slavery we know from modern history. In biblical times, slavery was often tied to poverty, debt, or war, and slaves were an accepted part of the societal structure. In the Old Testament, the laws about slavery aimed to regulate the practice and protect vulnerable people. For example, in Exodus 21, verses 2-6, Hebrew servants were to be set free after 6 years of service. But at the same time, non-Hebrew slaves could be held permanently, as seen in Leviticus 25, verses 44-46. This raises difficult questions. Why didn't God outlaw slavery outright? Theologians suggest that these laws reflect an attempt to mitigate harm in a broken, ancient world rather than endorse slavery itself. Even then, there are glimpses of justice. For example, Deuteronomy 23 verses 15-16 commands that runaway slaves must not be returned to their masters, but allowed to live freely. That's a radical idea for the time. But what about the New Testament? It reflects the Roman Empire's system of slavery. In his letters, the Apostle Paul speaks directly to slaves and masters. While he doesn't call for the abolition of slavery outright, he plants the seeds of change. Take the book of Philemon, for instance. Paul writes to a slave owner, urging him to treat his runaway slave, Onesimus, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother in Christ. While subtle, this was a revolutionary idea at the time, to see slaves as equals in Christ. At the heart of the Bible is a God who values justice, liberation, and the dignity of all people. The story of Exodus is a prime example. God hears the cries of the enslaved Israelites and intervenes to set them free from Pharaoh's oppression. This story became a symbol of hope for countless liberation movements, from the abolition of slavery to the civil rights movement. Jesus builds on this message of freedom. In Luke chapter 4, verses 18-19, Jesus declares that he has come to set the oppressed free. While he primarily speaks of spiritual freedom, many theologians argue that this also applies to systems of oppression, like slavery. And what about equality? In Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, Paul states, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." In God's eyes, every human being is of equal worth. These principles, liberation, justice, and equality, are the moral compass that many Christians believe should guide us today. Sadly, history shows us that the Bible was sometimes misused to justify slavery. During the transatlantic slave trade, verses like Ephesians 6:5, which says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters," were twisted to defend the practice. But the same Bible also inspired many abolitionists. Figures like William Wilberforce, Sojourner Truth, and Frederick Douglass drew on biblical themes of liberation to fight against slavery. Douglass, himself a former slave, boldly condemned the hypocrisy of Christians who defended slavery while preaching the gospel of love. The abolitionists understood that the Bible's overarching message, rooted in the dignity of all people, was incompatible with the horrors of slavery. Even today, Christians are working to end modern slavery, including human trafficking. Organizations like International Justice Mission fight to free people from forced labor and exploitation, inspired by the call to loose the chains of injustice from Isaiah 58:6. So what does God really say about slavery? While the Bible reflects the realities of its time, its overarching message points to a God of justice, freedom, and love. The Bible's laws regulating slavery were never meant to endorse it permanently, but to move humanity toward a vision of justice. As Christians, we're called to continue this work, seeking freedom and dignity for all people. Whether it's fighting modern slavery, promoting human rights, or simply loving our neighbors, the Bible calls us to stand against oppression in all its forms. The story doesn't end in ancient times. It continues with us today. So let's carry forward the message of justice, liberation, and love in everything we do. Thank you for watching. If you found this helpful, please like, share, and subscribe. And let us know in the comments, how do you see this message applying to today's world? See you next time.